All right, so we're live, and you know the drill. I gotta get the link and tweet it and
Oh yeah,
all that good stuff.
all that good stuff.
Hey, welcome everybody. I'm just getting the link.
Hey, welcome.
And once that's out, we'll get started here with Jack. Are you in Maine still today?
Still in Maine. Yeah.
Warming up there now, hopefully?
Yeah, we finally got the leaves on the trees maybe a week or two ago, so that's a nice improvement.
Right. Indeed. Cristobal. That name, I'm telling you. I've never met a Cristobal in my life. Have you?
Me neither. I don't know where they're pulling these names out of the hat from, but not Maine, that's for sure.
Hey everybody, getting ready to start up here in just a moment. Just spreading the link to the live feed around. Feel free to share it yourselves. Not a problem at all if you do that. So someone says it's pronounced Cristobal. I thought it was Cristobal. That's what Hurricane Center pronunciation says. C-R-E-E-S, like crease, and then T-O-H, toe, for the emphasis, Cristobal. Pretty sure it's Cristobal. 5 years of Spanish. It's a Hispanic, or it's Spanish. It's not necessarily Hispanic like Central America. It's more Spanish. I don't want to argue with somebody that's got 5 years of Spanish. Cristobal. He says Cristobal. Oh, we can just call it Chris for short. All right. One more link on Facebook, then we're going to get started here, folks. Live via YouTube with Jack Sillin as we discuss the latest on Tropical Storm Cristobal. See, when I say it that way, Siri picks it up. It spells it exactly right. For what it's worth.
That's how you know you're on the right track.
I just need to see like Ken Graham or somebody talking about it on a Hurricane Center update, and then you'll know.
For sure.
All right, get me situated. Hey. 3:05 Eastern. Yeah, it takes a few minutes to get everything disseminated. The current budget does not allow for a full-time social media person, so you're looking at him. Thanks to our patrons, I'm at least able to cover that as well. Anyhow, let's get on with it. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I am Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com, here in the bedroom studio of one of my kids. Crank the volume up so we can hear Jack. We're going to be talking with Jack Sillin from weathermodels.com. He was on with us in April, as we discussed weather models in general. And today we're going to go specific and talk about this tropical storm that begins with C. So let's respond to some text here, and then we're going to get on with it. All right, so I brought Jack in because Jack is, in my opinion, a guru. I was trying to explain that to my wife, and we had lunch together, and I was sending a text to one of my colleagues, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to be on live with Jack Sillin, this young man, and also a genius. And she's like, what do you mean also a genius? I was like, well, I think he's a genius. And she's like, well, you should say something different. I was like, no, it was this interesting argument on semantics and how you present the sentence. And I'm like, look, he's a young man, he's my son's age, and he's a genius. I'm trying to wrap that up into one. What are we missing here? And but he is. Jack's very smart. He's very good at communicating, and that's what this is all about. So I'm going to stop rambling and let's get Jack. He's behind me there. Hopefully the audio will come through. I can adjust it as needed. So live from the great state of Maine, I present Jack Sillin from weathermodels.com. How are you, Jack?
Doing great, Mark. Thanks so much for having me on again.
I like this because we're almost the same proportion, like you're sitting next to me. We've got it just right here in my kid's bedroom. All right, so first of all, let's talk about where we are currently with the tropical storm that begins with the letter C. There's a debate as to whether or not it's Cristobal or Cristobal, but we'll figure that out later. It made landfall this morning, 60 miles per hour, around 9:95. Did its organization and sort of the overachievingness, if that's a word, to date, and it seems to have overachieved, done pretty well for itself, structurally. Was that a surprise to you?
I would say it wasn't a huge surprise to me. So that what we saw as far as the systems organization was sort of well within the range of possible outcomes advertised by forecast model guidance.
But it wasn't like, so it wasn't one of these subtropical lows that, it came from that Central American gyre overall, and some of the DNA, if you will, from East Pacific Tropical Storm Amanda, but it really hasn't struggled, is what I'm getting at. It took advantage of some fairly early June climatology here, and, if it wasn't for land, I think it could have been a hurricane by tonight.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's sort of the key part that allowed this system to become as well organized as it did, in spite of the fact that we're still only in early June. The climatology, as you said, not quite as favorable, is that it had the sort of remnant spin from Tropical Storm Amanda. So while Amanda's low-level circulation died out over the mountains of Guatemala, its mid-level circulation is still spinning. You don't get that many mountains over 10,000 feet or so your circulation at around 10,000 feet actually crossed the Central American continent more or less intact. And I think that was the sort of tip-off point for a lot of us forecasters to say, all right, this is likely going to be able to regenerate fairly quickly because it was sort of starting from second base, if you will. It didn't have to go all the way around the diamond. It was starting about halfway there with this mid-level area spin. So I think that the forecast, would I have pegged it to landfall at 65 or 60 miles an hour? I don't think so. I probably would have been down more 50 or 55. But this certainly isn't something that had the eyeballs popping out of my head when I was looking at satellite imagery over the past couple of days.
Yeah, exactly. And so that leads me to wonder, even though it's over land now and the model guidance is suggesting that it's going to stay over land for at least 24 hours, it's done this well. It's kind of doing the Rocky Balboa. It's taking the punches, and it may emerge on the other side. And if it's done this well so far, why wouldn't it continue? We're not in October with strong cold fronts coming down, dry air. I mean, I know there's dry air around, but it just, as much as I like to intercept hurricanes, that's my job, I do have to be careful that confirmation bias doesn't start to set in. I do not wish for death and destruction on people, but I want to be able to go to work if needed. And so there's that line that, am I seeing something that's not there and ignoring the obvious? But so far, it seems to me that it has overachieved, done well for itself, especially in the face of climatology. And unless there are just mitigating circumstances, which we're going to talk about, what those circumstances might be, why not? And I think that in the end, if we compare it to Barry last year, I get this sense that at the end of this, it'll probably have more impacts than Barry. That's what I feel. We'll talk about that as we go forward. All right, so the guidance has come out from the morning runs of the models. And as we talked about when we had Jack on with us on a Hurricane U segment earlier this past spring, you've got global models, regional hurricane models, and their different abilities. And so what we're going to primarily focus on today is the 12Z guidance, meaning that it was initialized at 12 UTC. And the global model we're going to discuss today is the very popular and often very powerful European, the ECMWF model, and what it is depicting for the sea storm Cristobal or Cristobal going forward. All right, so Jack, which one of the graphics that you sent me do you want me to start with?
Let's start with ECMWF Shear 1. I think that's actually technically from the 0Z run this morning, but I've just sent you the 12Z version. It doesn't really matter which one you use because they are going to show you the exact same thing as far as the wind shear profile. To answer your question of why might this system have some harder times coming down the pike here. So I don't know
Got it.
What your system is. Oh, you got it? Awesome. So do you got the 12Z one or the 0Z one?
This is the 0Z. Sorry.
All right.
But they're going to be similar.
Worries.
Right.
Yeah, so I'll explain a few of the subtleties as far as the differences go. But basically, we have this, you can see Cristobal, the 0Z run had it just off the Mexican coast here, right at the far southeastern tip of the Bay of Campeche.
Right here.
The 12Z run actually has that, the center of Cristobal, about 50 to 75 miles farther southeast over the southwestern portion of the Yucatan Peninsula.
Okay.
But either way, it's sort of sitting at the southeastern quadrant of this trough. And you can see the trough, if you follow these little gray streamlines, that's indicating the wind direction. And the wind direction is out of the northwest over Texas, and it comes down into the northeastern, or northwestern rather, Gulf of Mexico. And then it sort of makes this turn. And then if you move to the central Gulf of Mexico, right around 90 west, 25 north, you see that the winds are then now out of the southwest. And that turning the corner, that's the hallmark of a trough axis in the upper levels. So,
Gotcha.
What happens out ahead of these trough axes? Well, we get these relatively strong southwest or westerly winds right at the base of those trough axes and right out ahead of them. And you can see that Cristobal, the circulation is somewhat evident here. You can tell there's a little bit of spin down there if you glance at the wind directions closely. But if you look just to the north of the system, you can see relatively strong westerly winds.
True.
And that marks a substantial difference from the upper level environment that the system has been enjoying over the past couple days, which has just been located under this area of upper level high pressure, which is basically helps to vent the system. It's had relatively minimal concerns from wind shear. And that is likely to be the key factor that changes once the system reemerges over water, whether that happened Friday morning or Friday afternoon, we're still not quite sure.
All right, so wind shear, as you all should know, is in this case, well, in all cases, it's the change of wind direction and speed with height. And so if Cristobal is moving one way and the shear is going over the top of it faster than is optimal, then those thunderstorms that are going up get blown off into one direction and the whole mass can get blown off. And if those thunderstorms cannot consolidate around that low pressure area, the whole process kind of gets messed up. That's a simplistic way to explain that. And the shear is pretty strong there to the north of the Yucatan Peninsula. That's what the color gradients are showing here. That is Cristobal down there at the bottom moving into that. Not good for development. I think that makes sense. All right, next graphic.
Yeah, so let's go to ECMWF Shear 2. And this is the same wind shear forecast, except it's for Saturday evening.
Okay.
And I think that if this storm is to make landfall as a hurricane, it would likely be a low-end hurricane, Category 1.
Right.
I think that represents sort of the upper bound of what this system is going to be able to achieve if sort of everything goes perfectly for the storm. Obviously, that would be the worst-case scenario
right.
for residents of coastal Louisiana. But basically, notice here that the center of circulation, the system, is located right around that 90 west, 25 north mark. That's where you see that spin in the wind direction. But if you look really closely at the arrows, you'll notice that they're spinning clockwise, right. Which is an indication of upper-level anticyclone or high-pressure system. And that, remember, is the feature that's been helping Cristobal along for the past several days.
Interesting.
So if the system can maintain or can get to this point on Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening, where it has a relatively consolidated inner core, a sort of maybe not a fully formed eye wall, right. but at least a good, healthy cluster of thunderstorms that hasn't gotten ripped apart by the shear earlier on Friday, if it can get to Saturday evening and be in a sort of relatively intact state, then I think it has a real window of opportunity to intensify as it's moving north towards the northern Gulf Coast. And another thing that's going to help with that is notice this sort of banana-shaped arc of very strong southwesterly to westerly winds. It sort of starts west of the storm center and then curves up through central Louisiana into central Mississippi and towards northern Alabama. That's an indication of what we call an upper-level jet streak,
gotcha.
Which is basically a pocket of strong winds near the top of the atmosphere. And you see that pocket of strong winds curved in this banana shape that as you're moving down it along with the wind, so imagine you're sort of riding a bus that's moving along with the wind here, and if you're turning off to the right like we are here, then that's an indication that you want to look for extra sort of rising motion, a little bit of an extra boost to any thunderstorms that are thinking about getting going. They're going to get a boost in the right entrance region of this jet streak.
Gotcha.
And that happens to be right where Cristobal is.
So that's a possible enhancing effect that could favor some intensification. This streak here, plus the anticyclone co-located in a small area over Cristobal's center. And it's going to be going over, for a time anyway, increasing upper ocean heat content that I discussed in today's Hurricane Outlook and discussion from this morning. The northern Gulf Coast, as you approach the northern Gulf of Mexico, as you approach Louisiana, the surface waters are plenty warm, but the upper ocean heat content is not that high. However, this is going to be moving fast enough that I don't think that's going to be an issue. But in this formative period here where it has a chance to strengthen, we do need to add the fact that there is a pocket of higher ocean heat content, as I showed this morning. All right, it's interesting. So next graphic, please, sir. This is great.
Yeah. So let's go to the EPS low locations 2. I think is a really important one here.
Okay.
And this is a sort of so if you watched our Hurricane U episode from back in April, you know that I talked about ensembles, how critically important they are.
Right.
And this is actually from the 0Z run of the ensembles. The 12Z run is just populating here on my computer screen. It shows a little bit more consolidation near the coastline, but basically singing the same song as what we're talking about here. So what's the key takeaway from this? Well, we still have a lot of uncertainty about two things. One, where the storm is going to be along its track. Right, so this is an example not of a long track spread rather than cross track spread, which indicates that we know roughly where the storm is going to go. It's going to go towards the north. But we don't necessarily know how fast it's going to be moving.
Makes sense.
And that's important for the intensity forecast. Because if the storm is moving sort of relatively slowly, it has a much better chance of getting that inner core together that it would need to take advantage of that favorable wind shear environment. So the caveat to our discussion of those enhancing effects is that the storm needs to be in a position to take advantage of that environment that's favorable.
Right.
And it can only do that if it isn't going to be ripped apart by the shear on Friday So the two scenarios we're sort of looking for are, is the storm going to be able to get to 90 west, 20 north, or 25 north rather, by later in the day on Saturday, intact and ready to strengthen when that favorable environment comes up? Or is it going to be basically blown to smithereens and unable to recover, even given the favorable environment? So how are we going to figure that out? Well, it's going to depend on where the storm emerges over water and when that happens. So one of the key issues with the 12Z ECMWF, and if you could go to the email I sent, not the most recent one, but the more recent one with the animation of the 12Z ECMWF.
Is it the, yeah, I think this is it. Is that it?
I can't see what you put up there, but
this is, hang on.
Yeah, no worries.
You only sent me one animation, right?
Yeah.
Then this should be it.
Awesome. All right, so
streamlines, etc.
Yeah. Yep. So this is the brand new hot off the presses 12Z ECMWF forecast for winds a little bit off the surface. And why do I use a little bit off the surface? Because the surface of the Earth and weather model forecasts do not get along very well. The models struggle to see features at the surface, terrain features, mountains, all sorts of that stuff. So often you'll get a better picture of what's going on overall if you head a little bit higher up into the atmosphere.
Okay.
So this is going to be the winds right around 2,000 to 2,500 feet above the surface.
Gotcha.
And you can see the sort of spin of the system. The center circulation is readily apparent. And note that after it dives south and southeast roughly for the next 12 hours towards far northeastern Guatemala, it's going to make that turn back to the north.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's going to be basically paralleling the coast, the west coast of the Yucatan Peninsula.
Right.
And it's going to be extremely important if the center tracks maybe even 10 or 20 miles west, which is a rounding error in weather model calculations.
Sure.
It's going to be over water, and it's going to be starting to rebuild its inner core. It's going to be in a better position to fight off the wind shear, especially if it's moving a little bit slower. That along track spread that we saw in the ensembles is going to play in here. But if it goes even 20 or 30 miles east, it's going to be over the Yucatan Peninsula for an additional 6 to 12 hours, in which case it will be continuing to decay. It won't be nearly as ready to face the shear in the southern Gulf of Mexico, and therefore it's not really going to be able to take advantage of that favorable environment later on. So that's why there's so much uncertainty here. And this has been an incredibly frustrating storm to forecast because there are these tiny errors that from a sort of scientific perspective are negligible, right? If we can get the storm's track to within 10 or 20 miles, I mean, that is an outstanding accomplishment.
Sure.
The problem is that those 10 or 20 miles are immensely consequential for the longer term forecast.
So does the blow up of convection over the water, let's say that were to happen out over the water, could that help to tug? And when we say convection, that's upward motion thunderstorms. You get a big blow up of convection and energy over the water. Could that help to tug that center more west? Or if it happened over land, but why? I mean, I know there's convergence and stuff that can happen over land, but is that a thing in this situation? You're talking about miles could make the difference. You get a big increase in convection to the west-northwest of that center. It pulls it west 10 to 15 miles. Game on, so to speak.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that we can get these big blobs of convection to tug the center in any different direction. We actually saw that with Cristobal about 24 hours ago. We had that persistent blob of convection over the northern Yucatan Peninsula, and that's what dragged the center of the storm east a little bit. So instead of drifting farther west and making landfall near Veracruz, we saw it make landfall just southeast of the city of Campeche. Sort of in that lagoon there. I don't know what the name of it is. But basically, we've already seen that happen in the case of Cristobal, and that's likely why the system isn't disintegrating in the mountains of near Veracruz right now. The problem with that convective burst occurring to the west-northwest of the system and tugging it over water is that wind shear that's coming out of the west that we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
So that's actually going to push most of the thunderstorm activity off to the east,
Okay.
which could likely, or perhaps, tug the system in the opposite direction.
Interesting.
So that's
all right.
one of those things where I think the odds are tilted towards, if we're going to have a blob of convection tugging the center of the storm 10 miles this way or that way, I think it's far more likely that we see that tug occur towards the east, given the shear profile.
And it's interesting. So it's going to come down to miles are going to matter, and hours are going to matter as well, because the longer this sits over land, the less time it's going to have to get itself physically ready to deal with the environment ahead. Very interesting. All right, next graphic, please.
Yeah, so that same 12Z animation one, the other graphic attached to that email is the latest 12Z forecast for the system's sea level pressure and precipitation distribution according to ECMWF.
Yep, 102 hours out. There we are.
Yeah. So this is really important because it shows what's likely to be the net result of this land interaction and wind shear process. So if you're along the Gulf Coast, this is why you care about these processes. What happens when a storm moves over land and starts encountering friction, it starts losing its deep convection, is all that angular momentum that's right. So that's the winds that are spinning very fast around the storm center, right near the center when it was over water. It starts to be dissipated throughout the rest of the storm. So while the winds near the center of the storm are weakening, the winds farther away from the center are strengthening. And the same is true for the thunderstorm activity, right? Where all the thunderstorms were neatly confined to right around the center when the system was over water, they're now going to start to spread out. And that spreading out is not a process that's easily reversible, if reversible at all.
Right.
So what you see here in this forecast from the ECMWF is you see this broad system, right? If you were to take these dark greens as being the areas of intense thunderstorm activity, you have some near the center here, a little bit to the west of the center, but really it's just strung out in these big bands that extends from south of Lake Charles, Louisiana, through southern Louisiana, New Orleans, and then all the way out towards Tampa, Florida. So even though Tampa, Florida might be 200 or 300 miles east of the center, they could actually see much more in the way of impacts from this system than, say, Houston, Texas, which is going to be much closer to the center, but off to the west. And remember, the wind shear is still coming out of the west, which is going to basically make this, what I think is most likely is you're going to get this big lopsided system where the winds near the center of the storm might be 70 miles an hour, might be 60 miles an hour, maybe even 80 miles an hour, so it could be a low-end hurricane. But really, what we are going to look for as a result of this land interaction is a much wider distribution of generally lower to moderate impacts, as opposed to a very small consolidated area of more extreme impacts.
So more people would be impacted by this in the form of heavy rain bands, gusty winds from time to time, rough seas, impacts to the oil industry offshore, and we are now talking about the potential of the Florida Peninsula all around the Gulf Coast, the I-10 corridor, into and across southern Louisiana. This is why paying attention to only, is it a hurricane or not? And I don't care, it's all I want to know, is not the bottom line. And then you start going out from there, the categories, etc. And that's why I wanted to bring Jack on, that we understand the broader picture with this, that we don't just categorize something and go on that alone. And so this is hundreds of miles of coastline and a lot of population areas, a lot of people wanting to get to the beach. This is going to be happening over the weekend. We are dealing with a lot of other issues going on in our lives right now, and this on top of that is important to keep up with. So a larger spread out system impacting more people, very important to take that away. Very good, Jack. All right. Anything else on this one before we move on?
Yeah. So along those lines, not only are more people going to be impacted, but another thing to keep in mind is this broad wind field, even though it might not be necessarily as strong, is actually going to pack probably even more power, right? If you were to take just, instead of measuring one gust in the eye wall, you're measuring over this broad area, you actually have more power to a broad system like this. And where that comes in, especially in the impacts that you see from that, are especially in the form of the storm surge. So this is not going to be a catastrophic storm surge event by any means. You need a much stronger system to produce those 5 to 10 foot surges. But because it's so broad, a wide swath of the Louisiana coastline, Mississippi, Alabama, even into parts of the Florida Panhandle are likely to be dealing with a smaller but still not negligible storm surge. So a wide swath of the coastline is still too early to put precise numbers on these, but I'm going to ballpark it probably in the 1 to 3 foot range for most spots. And that's much larger than you would expect to see from a smaller compact system, and it's also enough to cause problems, especially in these low-lying areas that have been dealing with flooding. That it doesn't take a major storm anymore to cause flooding in these spots. So you even put a 1 to 3 foot storm surge, and you're going to start to have some problems. So that's another thing to keep in mind. These larger systems pack more of a punch in the surge, even though they might pack less of a punch in terms of the maximum winds.
Right, and there's going to be other hazards. You're going to have the potential of water spouts in some of these bands offshore. Maybe some severe weather once it gets inland. We'll address that in just a little bit. All right, what can we look at next?
All right, let's take a look at the ECMWF Heights 2. So this is going to be a little bit more of a zoom out, and the idea of this graphic is to show you where Cristobal sits in the context of the larger weather pattern, and what clues that might have for its track as it approaches the coast and as it moves inland. So you notice Cristobal here is this blue splotch south of Louisiana. You see that there right near the 582 label. And you notice that that's sitting due south of this red splotch, which is an area of high pressure. That ridge of high pressure is the flow around that, or the winds around that, are moving clockwise, which means that on its southern periphery, the winds are going to be moving from east to west. And that's actually the feature that's going to be steering Cristobal as it's making landfall. So what we could see happen is the storm moves up, it's about to landfall in Louisiana, and then it takes a left and sort of parallels the coast, drifts towards the eastern part of Texas before it finally is able to move into the gap between the ridge over Missouri in this image here and the trough over Nevada and parts of California.
Over there.
So that's something to watch that could definitely prolong the impacts, especially in the state of Louisiana. It could bring parts of eastern Texas into play for heavy rain, gusty winds, and severe weather. And then the system is going to slide in between this trough and that ridge that we're talking about.
Right, because these things move.
You can see that gap is... Yeah, they're going to be going right between the two, and as that happens, it's going to make a turn off to the north, and then eventually off to the northeast. That's the recurvature process that we normally look for off the eastern coastline, but instead is going to be happening a little bit too late over the Mississippi valleys. So the system could actually remain an issue as far as heavy rains, gusty winds, and severe weather all the way up through parts of the Mississippi Valley, into the Ohio Valley, and into parts of the Great Lakes, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic. That's another thing you watch for. Yeah, next week, right? We're talking even 7+ days out from now. So obviously, low confidence forecast. This isn't something that we're 110% confident on yet, but it's something to keep in mind that whereas a very strong storm might fall apart quickly after it moves on land, these weaker systems are actually better positioned to meander farther inland, especially when they're interacting with these other atmospheric features like that ridge and trough. So whereas we might be used to seeing a storm make landfall and then sort of dissipate relatively quickly, may not be the case for this one. You may have to keep an eye on it even if you live hundreds of miles from the Gulf Coast.
Fascinating stuff, folks. This is what we're talking about here, being able to break this down and analyze it from the real world perspective. What's going to happen with you? And we're talking about a lot of people. As we've discussed these different possibilities, we go back to the this one, the larger rain shield and all those impacts along the coast. And then as Jack talked about it moving inland, we're going to have to deal with that later on. And don't forget, you can follow Jack on Twitter. And I'll put a link to that in the description of today's video. Also the weathermodels.com site and some of these graphics that you can track online yourself for free. As well as if you subscribe to their service, you won't regret it. great products, and it kind of brings to light what Jack's talking about, and you can follow along at home, as they say. But Jack will be on top of this. He is famous, in my mind at least, and hopefully yours too, for these great annotations where you take a graphic, you mark it up, you annotate it, and it really helps to tell a story. He can take, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, Jack can go into that picture and add a couple hundred extra words in the form of annotation, and you get a beautiful graphic that's basically an infographic at that point, and he'll be keeping on top of that long after we're done with today's discussion. All right, so moving along, anything else you want to show?
Well, I think that was all the graphics I sent you, but if you wanted me to flip around the camera, it's about time for me to do my annotated spaghetti plot of the day.
Sure.
So if you're interested in following along with that, I can do my best to pull it up here. So I start, of course, with yesterday's forecast. That's right there. Gotta figure out a way to prop my camera up here a little bit better. This is the unscripted portion of the show.
That's right. That's what's nice about it.
We didn't plan that ahead of time, but I thought of it when you mentioned that, and thought it might be interesting to see what goes behind these plots here. So, anyways, I'm going to delete the old map. This was the yesterday's 12Z run. I'm going to go over to weather models and pick up the new run. So for those who do have the weather models, this is oh no, it's still on the zeros. Oh no, wait, this looks like the new one, I think. Anyways, this is the one that we got, so it's the one we're going to use. So then I'm going to go back and put it in here. And this is a really important part of the process, actually starting from yesterday's forecast,
right,
and then moving into today's forecast. So I'm not starting from starting from ground zero would be much harder.
Sure.
We're actually
keep building
starting
on it
from a point where we can compare,
right,
to yesterday's. So. All right, let's take this one. It's actually going to be a little bit easier to do the comparison. To keep the same domain, that's really important that we're trying to maintain everything as closely as we can. So the first thing to do is now we'll be able to, by doing this, we're going to be able to overlay yesterday's forecast on top of today's new forecast, right? So you can immediately see some visual clues about. Yesterday it looked like roughly equal chances, for example, that the storm was going to track along this blue arrow, or this blue arrow. Now we're really consolidating around that middle one, right? We have relatively few ensemble members going off towards the northwest.
Gotcha.
Over the central Gulf, and we have many fewer members going off to the northeast rather. So I'm going to take these arrows, I'm going to move them a little bit closer together to represent the sort of range of possible outcomes. And that's really helpful now because our range is smaller, right? We're narrowing down on what exactly is going to happen to the storm. So one thing that we can nicely do now is delete this discussion of whether Cristobal would drift southwest into the Mexican mountains. That didn't happen, of course, because the burst of convection popped up northeast of the center yesterday afternoon. So we can get rid of that. It'll make it a little bit cleaner to take a look at the new forecast. So now we have basically yesterday we were talking about Cristobal remaining nearly stationary tonight, tomorrow. So that would be now today, and may complete a cyclonic loop of unknown radius. So we didn't know how tight this turn north was going to be. Now we do know it's not going to be that tight, right? It's not going to stay offshore. It's going to be somewhere farther down here. So we're going to just tweak these arrows a little bit to show that now it's that sort of northern solution, more or less off the table. We're really honing in on these more southern solutions. So I'll go type up something later about to make that sound a little better. Next, we have these three arrows that sort of Friday evening start to turn to the north. We really don't need all three now. Again, thankfully starting to narrow down the range of possible outcomes. So because we're ruling out that northern track or remaining offshore or right along the shore, I'm going to delete that western arrow, move the other two in, and now we're, again, this sort of signaling that we're increasing increasing our confidence here, because of course the fewer arrows, the more likely, or the more confident I am that the storm is going to follow one of those arrows. So that's that right now. We've covered the or the near term rather, what's going to happen in the next 24 to 36 hours. Starting to move into the medium range. Hear what's going to happen earlier in the weekend, and then moving into the middle part of the weekend. So the next question mark is going to be, to what extent does that ridge we were talking about earlier basically knock the storm towards the west or west-northwest? The answer is, well, we still don't quite know, right? You can see some of these tracks, some of these little individual spaghetti lines are moving basically due north, right? There's one of them here that's moving basically due north, but most of them are starting to basically curve back to the west. So to make this a little bit cleaner, it doesn't look like we're going to do this sort of full turn to the west, but I'm going to keep these 3 arrows here, move them a little bit closer together, so that we see that, the storm is not likely to be southeast of the southeastern portion of Louisiana.
Right.
So we're going to just move that to represent the eastern eastern edge of the range of possible outcomes there. And then, of course, we have plenty of uncertainty. Here's our total rotten pot of spaghetti about how quickly the storm turns off to the northeast. So I'm going to basically edit these arrows to more closely represent the full range of possible outcomes, which seems actually to be a little bit wider, right? So while confidence is increasing in most of the portions of the forecast here, especially those that we care about along the coast of Louisiana and Texas, confidence actually decreased a little bit overnight and today about exactly how the storm is going to interact with the mid-latitude jet stream, how it's going to interact with that trough and ridge. So we'll spread our arrows out a little bit more to reflect that uncertainty. So that's basically the process I go through. It's a matter of starting with what you had in the previous forecast and then seeing where it needs to be tweaked, if anywhere. So I'll go through and type. I won't bore you with the process of typing out all these little descriptions and so on and so forth. But I thought you might find it interesting to see what goes into those graphics. I'm pleased that so many folks find those helpful on Twitter. And now you've got a little bit of inside baseball about how they work and are created. So
modern day Bob Ross right here. That's how he does it. Let's just put a nice little arrow right here. Arrow's just hanging out there. Maybe it's going to go to the northeast. It doesn't care. Yeah, man. Hey, look, he's got a HurricaneTrack t-shirt on as well. Send him one of those.
Oh, yeah.
After his appearance with us on Hurricane U. All right, so bottom line, the storm with the sea name, Cristobal, whatever you call it, at least when we get to Dolly, that one's going to be straightforward. We have to watch it, not because we think that there's a possibility of a powerful hurricane. I know it's like the movie Jaws when the mayor comes up to the police chief and says, "You say barracuda?" And everybody's like, what? But you say shark. I understand that people really perk up when they hear the word hurricane. And then they perk up even more when they hear major hurricane. But we have to put that away and think of impacts. What is it going to do to me? You wouldn't think of a small rattlesnake versus a 6-foot rattlesnake biting you. They're both dangerous. They are both still rattlesnakes. And whether it's a 60-mile-per-hour tropical storm or a 160-mile-per-hour hurricane, yes, they are both starkly different in the amount of energy and the way that energy is focused, but they are both dangerous for similar and different reasons, and we want to broaden your horizons in understanding the entire picture. All right, so Jack, I appreciate it very much. I will be on top of this, of course, posting on Twitter, on Patreon. Again, thanks to our patrons, our crowdfunding group, for helping to make this possible. And crowdfunding is what makes this work. And we appreciate that very much. You can look into that more in the description of today's video, as well as links that I will post from the weathermodels.com site. Jack, anything else you want to add before we let you go, sir?
That's it for me. Thanks so much for having me on again, Mark. Hopefully we'll get to do this again sometime soon.
Well, one really neat thing that we are able to do now that I tested, I'll wrap up with this point. Went out to Texas and worked with a couple of my colleagues to test some of our equipment. I'm wearing the Herbie Hurricane Research Balloon t-shirt. We launched the weather balloon and did some testing with that. By the way, Jack, we were able to achieve 105,000 feet, a record for us with that weather balloon. And the video is absolutely remarkable. We also have great upper air data, some of those temperatures dipping to minus 48, minus 56 Celsius. We still have to analyze a lot of that. The idea is to do that in the eye of a hurricane and in daylight hours. We did it in Hurricane Nate in 2017, but that was at 1:30 in the morning. We have great data from that, but we also want the great video, and that's what we test. But anyway, on the way out there to Texas and back, we were testing the ability to composite a bunch of different things on top of the live feed from the vehicle. And the gentleman that handles that for us, his name is Mike Cornelius from Orlando, one of our crowdfunding partners, not only with his financial support, but his intellect to figure this stuff out. We can now bring people in right on top of our live feed via Skype. So I am leaving for Louisiana either tomorrow or Friday. The Gulf Coast as a whole, it looks like. In fact, this discussion here has opened my eyes to, hey, I need to focus on a lot larger area. But I hope that we can bring Jack in and interact with him while I'm driving down the highway. It's going to be amazing. Kind of like television, but on the internet, right? So it's not like we're inventing something you've never seen before, but for us, it's going to be remarkable. So that would be really neat if we could do that with you on Saturday, probably, Jack. Just bring you in while I'm driving down the road. There's Jack in the corner, picture in picture, and you can take it away. That's going to be exciting.
Awesome. Yeah, sounds great.
All right, that'll do it for me and Jack. Again, weathermodels.com. I'll put links to stuff in the description just a few minutes after I hit stop. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you learned something. I am Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com. I'll be back with more for you tomorrow. Hit the button here.